Right, so hello everybody. My name is Davidel. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Lorraine, a member of the research unit IDEA. My thesis looks at representations of liminality in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles and focuses on monstrosity, sexuality, and procreation. Content warning, there will be a discussion of pain, death, mutilation, but I will give a signal before that so you know, in case you just want to mute and come back later. Right, so this talk will focus on Rice's vampire women as liminal figures who embody a paradox of impairment and power. I will begin my discussion with theoretical aspects regarding liminality, disability, and the Gothic, and then look more specifically at 5 vampire women in Rice's first 3 Vampire Chronicles. So you have the 3 book covers over there with the years, interview with the vampire published in 1976, the Vampire Lista published in 1985, and Queen of the Damned published in 1988. Now, the characters chosen for this analysis are Claudia, the vampire reduced to a miniature childlike body, Gabrielle, who escapes death and disease through vampirism. I will also discuss Akasha's infirm posture as a statue, which contrasts her awakening and her hyperactive killing spree. Finally, Mekare and Maharet's impairments will also be considered in relation to the power that the twins are said to possess. Now, Rice depicts the vampire as this glamorous and sensual creature, driven by a gender-free bloodlust. These androgynous immortals are no longer defined by gender roles and heteronormativity. Since they do not engage in genital sex, we are told that distinctions between femininity and masculinity are irrelevant, and they melt in the aura of fluidity that surrounds Rice's vampires. In a 1993 interview, Rice stated, and I quote, "I really see the vampires as transcending gender. If you make them absolutely straight or gay, you limit the material. They can be either one. They have a polymorphous sexuality. They see everything as beautiful," end of quote. In her autobiography, Rice refers to her work as the product of this, and I quote, "genderless and over-sensuous mind," end of quote. So we have this idea that vampires are endowed with a high sensitivity to beauty in both humans and the other undead. Immortality enables them to explore their desires and move along the gender spectrum, free from human-made taboos and constraints. However, if we look beyond this gender-free perspective provided by beauty, we observe that Rice's vampire women are generally given secondary roles, or at times they are even effaced to the advantage of homoerotic relationships. Louis, Lestat, Marius, and Armand, and I put some pictures there. I personally am not very happy with the depiction of Armand in an interview with a vampire, but well, we're waiting for the TV series to come up. So, Rice's vampire narrators have always been humanized because they tell their own stories, and they confess their struggles between the compulsion to feed and their moral battles in the aftermath of taking human life. In doing so, they provide a different angle on the well-known trope, the sympathy for the devil, due to their introspective description of the pitfalls of living forever, which are madness, disconnection from the human world, loss of meaning, and even suicide attempts. What about the vampire women? Well, vampire women are somehow othered. They do not appear to experience the morality struggles that are prominent in the majority of the male undead. Claudia, Gabrielle, and Akasha can take human lives and destroy the bodies of their victims with no trace of remorse. Their powers are generally dormant or limited, which suggests that Rice privileges the male immortals, a move that contradicts her claim of creating vampires that transcend genders. Even the role of procreation is ascribed to male vampires, and there are only a few cases in which a woman immortal shares the dark gift. Despite their silence and coldness, women vampires achieve some liberation from social and cultural constraints, but also gain an acute awareness of the limitations of their bodies. More often than not, women immortals are represented as mindless or reduced to a form of passivity, only to reactivate themselves in an excess of dynamism. In this sense, their immortality becomes a liminal experience underpinned by bodily impairments and monstrous power. Vampire women are surrounded by an atmosphere of mystery because they are given only limited space to tell their stories. While Rice's chronicles are essentially narrated by male, yet highly feminized vampires, women's accounts are fragmented or told from a third-person point of view. In the third book of the series, Queen of the Damned, Maharet's story becomes central to understanding the origin of the undead. However, unlike Louis and Lestat, who are, and I quote from Nina Auerbach, compulsive storytellers, Maharet's effort to recount her story of pain and transformation is rather a duty to the other undead, especially in the context of Akasha's awakening. It is only in 1998, when Pandora is published, that a vampire woman offers a lengthy account of her adventures, considering the fact that Interview with a Vampire appeared in 1976. Pandora is part of a secondary series called The New Tales of the Vampires, which I find ironic because her story goes back to Imperial Rome and predates Louise's and Lestat's accounts. Vampires have always been liminal. They have been imagined as creatures who blur categories, among which life and death, femininity and masculinity, and I would argue disability and ability. According to Victor Turner, and I quote, "Liminal entities are neither here nor there. They are betwixt and between the positions assigned and arrayed by law, custom, convention, and ceremonial." End of quote. They are thus characterized by ambiguity and fluidity. Turner associates liminality to a series of tropes that have been prevalent in Gothic fiction. And I quote, "Death to being in the womb, to invisibility, to darkness, to bisexuality, to wilderness, and to an eclipse of the sun and moon." End of quote. Turner argues that the liminal phase in initiation rites incorporates three essential aspects. One is the sense of a disrupted temporality when, and I quote, "the past is momentarily negated, suspended or abrogated, and the future has not yet begun." End of quote. Secondly, there is a spatial passage where the threshold is considered in literal or symbolic terms. He considers it, and I quote again, "a realm of pure possibility whence novel configurations of ideas and relations may arise." The third aspect represents an ambiguous state in which the individual is neither dead nor alive, but stripped of identity and property. These characteristics are easily recognizable in the vampire. The idea of being out of time defines the immortal's existence. The separation from society points to the disintegration of the vampire's previous human identity, but also to a release from human's system of categorization, which no longer applies to the undead. However, the ambiguous state is most apparent in the case of Rice's vampire women because they are presented as spectral. They are seen but seldomly heard, they suddenly disappear, or their supernatural power is rooted in myth. The Gothic has always been concerned with a blurring of categories defining our existence. The disabled body encodes anxieties regarding the fine line between ability and disability. To some extent, we are all liminal because, according to Rosemary Garland Thompson, and I quote, that anyone can become disabled at any time makes disability more fluid and perhaps more threatening to those who identify themselves as normids, end of quote. Furthermore, Rosemary Garland Thompson observes that disability is only seldomly presented as, and I quote, part of the spectrum of human variation, the particularization of individual bodies, or the materialization of an individual body's history. After all, if we live long enough, we all become disabled, end of quote. I think we can link these ideas regarding disability with the Gothic, especially in terms of the anxieties that disability produces because it makes us aware of the vulnerability of our own bodies. The convergence between disability and liminality is particularly interesting in Irina Metzler's argument that, and I quote, impaired persons are neither sick nor healthy. Their condition is not an illness that either disappears again or gets worse and kills the individual, but a permanent, incurable state between the two categories of health and illness, end of quote. This idea of permanent condition corresponds to the vampire's liminality. They are not only at the threshold between life and death, but also at the border between power and disability. To some extent, vampirism in itself disables the undead body in daytime, confining it to darkness and to what Louis refers to as, and I quote, the paralytic sleep. Furthermore, in her introduction to Demons of the Body and Mind, Essays on Disability in Gothic Literature, Ruth Bienstock-Anlich associates visible disability with horror and invisible disability with terror, two essential emotions recurrent in Gothic fiction. In my discussion of Rice's vampire women, I will adopt this analogy in order to approach the contrast between impairment and power. The concept of invisible disability is particularly important here since, like vampiric monstrosity, it cannot be easily identified by the onlooker. Even though the transformation into a vampire is envisaged as a means of fighting the imminent decay of the human body, it does not really erase the imprints of disability. I would like to draw your attention to an important distinction between disability and impairment. Rosemary Garland Thompson defines disability as, and I quote, a representation, a cultural interpretation of physical transformation or configuration, and a comparison of bodies that structures social relations and institutions. On the other hand, for Irina Metzler, the term impairment refers to the physiological phenomenon, to the biological fact, the bodily manifestation, and describes the purely anatomical. This distinction is important for my discussion here because while both terms refer to bodily difference, disability carries the connotation of deficiency and inferiority. It involves the idea of a so-called normal gaze that stares in wonder and horror at bodily difference. I will use the term impairment both due to its implication of liminality between health and illness, but also because it can be extended to invisible impairments as opposed to visible difference and ideas of inferiority encapsulated by disability. I will now move on to discuss Claudia, the infant death. Now, Claudia was created by the eccentric couple, Lestat and Louis, right in the middle of their so-called crisis, when Louis was considering the idea of parting with his companion. Since she was transformed into a vampire when she was barely 5 years old, Claudia's body is frozen in time and will never reach womanhood. In her case, the gift of immortality comes at a high price, as her body retains its childlike shape. Due to her miniature form but exquisite appearance, Claudia is not immediately perceived as disabled, but rather helpless. She is always dependent on either Lestat or Louis, as the latter mentions in an interview with a vampire. And I quote, "Go. Where would she have gone? She was a child no bigger than that. Who would have sheltered her? Would she have found some vault like a mythical vampire, lying down with worms and ants by day and rising to haunt some small cemetery and its surroundings?" End of quote. What Louis implies is that Claudia needed to be cared for, a state characteristic for the impaired and the children. Even the vampiric supernatural powers could not ensure her survival should she have chosen to live on her own. Also, because she had been trimmed in lace and finery, Louis assumes that Claudia would not be able to sleep in anything less than the coffin placed in their apartment in Rue Royale. Claudia plays the role of the helpless child by turning her miniature form to her advantage. She deceives and attracts the sympathy of her unsuspecting adult victims, and I quote, "And to watch her kill was chilling. She would sit alone in the dark square, waiting for the kindly gentleman or woman to find her, her eyes more mindless than I had ever seen Lestat's. Like a child numbed with fright, she would whisper her plea for help to her gentle, admiring patrons. And they carried her out of the square. Her arms would fix about their necks, her tongue between her teeth, her vision glazed with consuming hunger." Through Louise's eyes, Claudia is represented as a monstrous child with an angelic face, yet driven by this devouring power. She is not guided by conscience, but by hunger, which crystallize in her mindless eyes. This makes her even more monstrous than her father's, the infant death, as Lestat calls her. Now, interestingly, Louis and Lestat do not immediately perceive Claudia's eternal childlike form as impairment, because for them, the vampiric body is inherently ageless. Louis becomes aware of Claudia's change only when she begins to display the signs of womanhood. And I quote, "Yet more and more her doll-like face seemed to possess two totally aware adult eyes, and innocence seemed lost somewhere with neglected toys and the loss of a certain patience. There was something dreadfully sensual about her lounging on the settee in a tiny nightgown of lace and stitched pearls. She became an eerie, a powerful seductress. Her voice as clear and sweet as ever, though it had a resonance which was womanish, a sharpness sometimes that proved shocking." Louis's description of Claudia suggests her trapped femininity, but also a certain liminality between the child and the woman. Claudia gains an uncanny agency as a powerful seductress, and she develops a woman-ish and not a woman's voice. This indicates that Claudia's femininity develops in a body too small to contain it, haunting a consciousness for which it becomes a painful reality. Claudia develops an obsession for the female body that can truly be sensual and seductive. She kills two maids, but preserves their bodies precisely because they have what she lacks, the traits of a woman. Not surprisingly, she chooses a mother and her daughter as an echo of her own repressed idea of a mother. There is an uncanny symmetry between Louis and Lestat's discovery of Claudia's female victims in the kitchen and their awareness that she has developed the mind of a grown-up woman. Rice recognizes that the character of Claudia is, and I quote, "the embodiment of my own failure to deal with the feminine. She is a woman trapped in a child's body. She is the person robbed of power," end of quote. Rice is also influenced by the loss of her daughter Michelle, who died of leukemia at the age of 6. Claudia becomes aware of her physical impairment and begins to ask questions about her transformation. She challenges her fathers for answers and declares to Louis that, and I quote, "now the slip of 65 years has ended," end of quote, which means that her period of inactivity and subordination to the patriarchal power has ended. When she obtains no answer about the power of transformation, Claudia retreats, but resorts to her only power, that of killing. She weakens Lestat by offering him 2 small boys whose blood has been poisoned and then stabs him. She uses the male-to-male desire that she saw in Lestat as a vehicle for death and poison. Claudia kills one father, or rather the usurper of a mother, only to free herself from him and continue her relationship with the other, with Louis. The symbiosis between Claudia and Louis and their shared quest for origins take them to Europe. Yet Claudia still feels disadvantaged by her small body, an element that becomes more apparent when she condemns Louis for refusing to transform Madeleine, a grown-up woman, for her. To some extent, Claudia uses Louis' guilt for damning her to the body of a child. And I quote, "you haven't tears enough for what you've done to me. 6 more mortal years, 7, 8, I might have had that shape," end of quote. In her expression of rage, Claudia returns to her impairment, which excludes her from the physical superiority of the other vampires, such as those that they meet in the theater of the vampires. Claudia is sentenced to death because she attempted to kill her maker, Lestat. However, Armand's book, The Vampire Armand, offers an essential detail for understanding Claudia's tragic fate. So, spoiler alert, in case you didn't read the book, be warned. So, Claudia's obsession for the female body makes her subject herself to Armand's surgery, which is, in a way, another form of patriarchal power. She does this in order to rid herself of her miniature shape. Armand confesses in his book that, and I quote, "I tried to grant her her fondest wish, that she should have the body of a woman, a fit shape for the tragic dimension of her soul. Well, in my clumsy alchemy, slicing heads from bodies and stumbling to transplant one to the other, I failed. Let me say here, she was herself again, hideously wounded, a botched resemblance of the angelic child she'd been before my attempts, when she was locked out in the brutal morning to meet her death with a clear mind. The fire of heaven destroyed the awful, unhealed evidence of my satanic surgery as it turned her to a monument in ash," end of quote. Armand's surgery echoes Victor Frankenstein's creation of the monster, only manages to inscribe a horrific deformity on Claudia's new body. With this new layer of monstrosity, Claudia becomes an abominable creature that has no place among the elitist vampires. If Claudia's childlike shape is invisible to the vampires surrounding her, The visibility of her new deformity is highly disturbing to the ideal of beauty and perfection cultivated by Rice's vampires. According to Armand's story, Claudia accepts her death with a clear mind, or presumably with a horror and abhorrence of her new body. I'd like to move on now to Gabrielle, the liberated mother. Rice describes at length the strong affinity that developed between Lestat and his mother even before his transformation into a vampire. In fact, one of the central elements of the story, in the story of Lestat's human life is, and I quote, the unshakable love of her, end of quote. Gabrielle suffers from consumption and warns Lestat that she feels her end approaching, and I quote, I won't survive another winter, I know. The pain in my lungs is too bad. I just wanted to speak it to another soul, to hear it out loud. I'm perfectly horrified by it. I'm afraid of it, end of quote. What we see in Gabrielle's case is an invisible impairment that she keeps secret, although it manifests as the shadow of pain. When Lestat as a vampire meets his dying mother, Gabrielle's body has already begun the process of disabling, the deterioration caused by consumption. She needs assistance in order to move. And Lestat confesses, and I quote, I could smell death on her. I could smell decay, end of quote. So content warning for pain. So if you want to move now, that's okay. So here we are given access to Gabrielle's tortured soul as Lestat reads her thoughts. And I quote, let the pain get worse, because only when the pain is really dreadful do I want to die. If the pain would just get bad enough so that I'd be glad to die and wouldn't be so frightened. I want it to be so terrible that I'm not frightened, end of quote. So this relation between the fear of death and pain, two extreme emotions prevalent in the Gothic, overwhelm Gabrielle, both at a bodily and mental level. This acute sense of dread corresponds to what Xavier Aldana Reyes refers to as the Gothic affect, because pain and fear of death are part of, and I quote, the text's Gothic machinery, end of quote, meant to, and quoting again, evoke a concurring emotion or visceral reaction, end of quote. As readers, we are affected by these elements, and I would argue that Gabrielle's suffering makes her transformation into a vampire a viable solution even before Lestat actually decides to perform it. So end of content warning signal, right? The vampirization and the transformation of the mother represent the symbolic union between Lestat and Gabrielle, an incestuous union that is concluded in two steps. First, through a return to memories from childhood, and second, through the desire of devouring the mother. In Lestat's thirst for her, the figure of the mother melts into that of a lover, so that by the end of the intimate exchange of blood, Gabrielle is no longer the mother, but the lover. Lestat gives back life to her as she had given to him, in a symmetry that defies the laws of nature. In her new existence, Gabrielle is no longer defined by the physical immobility or by what seems to have been the restrictive and limitative role of a mother. In a sense, she moves beyond the state of the spectral female, trapped in a marriage and household that erases her identity, namely what Diana Wallace reads in her theorizing of the female Gothic as, and I quote, metaphors of women imprisoned, buried alive, and as ghosts, end of quote. So Gabrielle regains her individuality and life with the possibility of being herself, her original self, without the requirements of society being inscribed onto her. As a vampire, Gabrielle is empowered to express her gender fluidity and her aversion towards the norms of femininity to which she was subjected in her human life. And I quote, "She tore off the pink velvet girdle and skirts right there and put on the boy's clothes. And to describe it more truly, as she put on his garments, she became the boy. But there's no real reason for me to dress that way anymore, is there?" she asked. Now, I find this idea of not needing to dress as a woman particularly interesting because it is indicative of a post-feminist strand in Gabrielle. Symbolically, she places herself beyond the socially constructed gender binary and operates this change of appearance precisely because her former experience as a woman was limiting. Her strongest attachment to Lestat makes her identify with him. And I quote, "She spoke in an almost eerie way of my being a secret part of her anatomy, of my being the organ for her which women do not really have," end of quote. So thus the melancholia for the gender she does not possess is highly visible, although it can also be read as a symbolic impairment. Another element that allows a post-feminist reading of Gabrielle is her return to nature. She assumes the role of the explorer of nature, an individualistic turn that takes her free spirit on private journeys. This ultimately distances her from Lestat, from the other vampires, but also from humans. Gabrielle turns her back to culture, privileging isolation. However, as Marius points out, and I quote, "She has the strength to re-enter the world when she chooses, or to live on its fringes indefinitely," end of quote. In other words, she is empowered by her liminality as a vampire. Now, moving on to Akasha, the living statue. Now, she's probably the most controversial of Rice's vampire women because she is primarily presented as a living statue and mysteriously lying in a deep sleep together with her consort Enkill. Rarely accepting victims, Akasha and Enkill are described as all-knowing gods in a state of ignorance. They seldomly communicate through telepathic images, and they are constantly referred to as those who must be kept, because it is believed that if they are left in the sun or harmed in any way, all the vampires would feel this and would probably die. Despite the ceremonial undertones of worship, the so-called parents must be kept in the sense of cared for, since their immobility corresponds to disability. Rice employs the myth of the Egyptian gods Isis and Osiris weaved into Marius's story of Akasha to describe this enormous power that the couple presumably has as the first vampires. Nonetheless, in their seeming vegetative state, Akasha and Enkill are held in hidden vaults and need to be cared, a task undertaken by Marius. As Lestat is introduced to what he first believes to be the statues of ancient Egyptian gods, he is overcome by a fusion of terror and horror at the realization that, and I quote, "They were alive and locked inside themselves. I knew the reason that he kept them. He could not bury them deep in the earth somewhere because they were conscious. He would not burn them because they were helpless and could not give their consent. But he kept them as ancient pagans kept their gods in temples that were their houses." End of quote. So the mythical ancestors of vampirism can be read as a metaphor for comatose bodies or disease in terminal stages. In such cases, the spark of life is hardly visible, and the question that haunts the living descendants is how the ancestors' bodies will be treated, as those of the living or as those of the dead. Marius has double function, that of a priest who worships the divine ancestors, offering human sacrifices, but also that of a caretaker, ensuring the well-being of the disabled parents, taking them out only at night to see the sea and safeguarding their shrine. Despite her passivity, Akasha is by no means the damsel in distress. She is described as the original fount from whom the sacred blood flows to rejuvenate and offer power to vampires. Akasha first gives signs of awakening at the end of the 18th century when Lestat plays the violin for her. Presumably, Lestat's presence revives her eroticism and stirs her attention and approval to give him the original blood. Akasha finally raises from the sleep in the 20th century when Lestat's video clips reach her through the television installed by Marius in her shrine. Surprisingly, when she awakens, Akasha demonstrates her strong feminist beliefs. She feels that she is the goddess who must protect women and decides to start a mass murdering of men whom she perceives as oppressors. She seduces and manipulates Lestat, asking him to join her in her mission of liberating women. In Undoing Feminism, Janice Doan and Devon Hodges read Akasha as, and I quote, a feminist monster, a woman more interested in maternal theories than in real people, end of quote. Rice underlines the madness of a queen that finds herself displaced from a world that she once ruled and which she wishes to regain. Akasha is one of the few strong female vampires that Rice presents in her novels, but at the same time, she's driven by a diseased will to have absolute ruling power through mass murder. And this, I would argue, makes her truly monstrous and heartless. Like the vampiric Lucy in Stoker's Dracula, Akasha poses a threat to men, or rather to all men, and needs to be destroyed. Stoker's Party of Light is replaced by the coven of vampires fearful for their own lives. Akasha is finally killed by Mekare, one of the twins who were themselves subjects of oppression. They suffered from the cruelty of the Egyptian queen because they were involved in witchcraft and ritualistic cannibalism. So ironically, we see Akasha fighting for the so-called liberation of women, whereas in ancient Egypt, she had caused the oppression of Maharet and Mekare. Content warning for mutilation. Okay, so be warned. The first Maharet was rendered blind, while the second was reduced to a mute state. Mekare consumes Akasha's brain and heart, following the same ritual feast that she and her sister had been condemned for. So thus she is ensuring the life of the vampires in the world. So remember that if Akasha were to be killed, all the vampires would die. So this ritualistic cannibalism ensures that vampires do continue. End of content warning. I will now turn to the twins. And I have put this beautiful rendition of Maharet and Mekare. I wasn't able to track down the person who made it, but I think it's just brilliant. So I really like it. So first, Maharet, who is the true immortal. Like the majority of Rice's vampire women, Maharet is presented through the perspective of a male immortal. Maharet's complexity is underlined through Marius's first impression when he meets her. And I quote, "Her eyes were not really her eyes. No, they had been taken from a mortal victim, and they were already failing her. She could not see very well, and she looked at him. Ah, the blinded twin from the dreams she was. And she felt pain now in the delicate nerves connected to the stolen eyes." End of quote. So again, content warning for mutilation. So what we have in Maharet's case is a visible impairment that is momentarily remedied through the monstrous act of stealing her victim's eyes. So we see Maharet through Marius's eyes as he himself looks at her eyes and sees the monstrosity that she is compelled to enact. Because the human eyes fade in her vampiric body, Maharet is dependent on her victims, not only for blood, but also for their eyes. Maharet's immortality encodes the horror of the impaired body, but also that of the act of bodily mutilation as she steals human eyes in order to endure. End of content warning. Furthermore, Marius also sees power in Maharet, and I quote, "The woman's vigor astonished him. It gave her an air of infinite flexibility and overwhelming menace. Was she the true immortal, the one who had never slept, never gone silent, never been released by madness? One who had walked with a rational mind and measured steps through all the millennia since she had been born?" End of quote. So we have this contrast between Maharet and Akasha. If Akasha had been the goddess who falls into a comatose sleep, Maharet retains a clear mind and witnesses the development of the human civilization. The implication here is that Maharet is in fact the true immortal who manages to retain her sanity. As I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, Maharet shares her story and that of the vampire's origins with the other undead. But she is only filling the blanks as her sister, Mekare, transmits the images of the past through dreams that torment the majority of the immortals. So there's an interesting complementarity here as the story is told both visually and verbally by the twins. I'll move on to Mekare, the Mindless One, and I have added Sydney Joanna Oliver's brilliant rendition of Maharet and Mekare. So unable to speak, but already transformed into a vampire, Mekare was separated from her sister and left drifting into the ocean. She becomes savage, isolated, lost in the Amazonian forests. When she's presumably awoken by Lestat, Mekare transmits telepathic visions of her and Maharet to the other immortals. However, Marius determines that, and I quote, "The origins of these dreams was almost certain, not a conscious survivor of the millennia. Rather, the visions had very possibly come from one who had no more mind now than an animal in whom memory is a spur to action, which the animal does not question or understand. It would explain the clarity. It would explain the repetition." End of quote. So while Marius's supposition regarding Mekare is dehumanizing, it does underline the impairment and yet the power that she possesses. On the one hand, Mekare is unable to speak, and yet she projects images and her sense of dread to the other undead. For example, Daniel feels, and I quote, "the darkness of the dream again around him, a woman's body, tongueless, terror closing him in," end of quote. Jessie, her descendant, also shares a strong connection to Mekare, and I quote, "I saw her No, that's not right. I saw her as if I were her. End of quote. Or as Mael observes, the dreams must be a communication, for why else would the message be so strong? Our private thoughts do not carry such power. She raises her voice. She wants someone or something to know what she's thinking. End of quote. So the vampires who gather to listen to Maharet also confess hearing or receiving dreams from Mekare. This again underlines the paradox of disability and supernatural power that Mekare possesses. Mekare returns to fulfill her curse on Akasha and consumes her brain and heart. She carries out the ritual, but otherwise remains, and I quote, expressionless, uncomprehending the living statue, end of quote, which confirms her mindlessness. So spoiler alert, in case you haven't read Prince Lestat, be warned. The Rise in Prince Lestat, published in 2014, introduces the technological advancements in medicine to analyze and confirm the presence of disability in Mekare as a possible effect of her being the host for the core of vampirism. And I quote, "They say Mekare was mindless. They said the brain in her head was atrophied. They said there was so little indication of brain activity that she was like a human in a coma, kept alive by the brain stem alone. The powerful blood had actually hardened the atrophied tissue over time." End of quote. So the same vegetative state that was visible in Akasha when she was the Queen of the Damned can be observed in Mekare's case. As the embodiment of a monstrous ancestor who cannot communicate, Mekare remains isolated from the vampire world that she is part of. Her only moment of clarity is marked by her silent approval of passing the sacred core to Lestat in an act of self-destruction. So Mekare relinquishes whatever power she has left, or at least symbolically, as she passes it to Lestat via the absorption of her brain. So to conclude, despite their secondary roles and the limited space to present their stories, Rice's vampire females, women, offer compelling perspectives on impairment and power. They assume the role of the repressed only to rebel and display the full extent of their power that strikes as unpredictable, monstrous, or subversive. Oscillating between visible and invisible forms of impairment, they are simultaneously othered and, to some extent, accepted by the vampire community. Their femininity is trapped, like in Claudia's case, relinquished altogether, as Gabrielle does, or magnified into a new religion, as it can be seen in Akasha's massacre plans. If the transformation into a vampire heals Gabrielle's decaying body, it proves to be limiting and unsatisfactory for Claudia. Also, vampirism cannot restore Mekare and Maharet's organs. The twins' supernatural power is rooted in myth. And I would like to end with a quote from Marius that I think underlines the liminality of Rice's vampire women. And I quote, "Most women are weak, be they mortal or immortal. But when they are strong, they are absolutely unpredictable." End of quote. Thank you. I shall finish here. Thank you for your attention, and I will stop sharing. Okay.
Cool. Thank you very much. That was a deep dive and very informative. Yeah, so if people have any questions, you might need a moment to process, but if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. There was a question from Roshni a little bit higher up. There's not much in the chat at the moment, so it should be quite easy to find.
Probably me. It's mostly me.
Yeah. No, that's fine. But, I mean, if you want to ask your question here, then please do.
Yeah, I can't remember what it was, but they were just thoughts, really. Thank you very much, Laura. It's really, I can start my video and inflict myself on you guys. Morning, all. It's really interesting talk, because it wasn't quite what I was expecting, because it's my first one. And I read the series, but not all of them, many years ago. But so your discussions about disability were really interesting, because I was a disability doctor. Rehab medicine is my specialty, so clinically, but I teach medical students, and I'm always looking at different ways in literature to use to teach them. So this is really useful. So thank you. You've given me some ideas. But I was interested in, so you didn't, obviously you didn't go through, there's all the medical models and the psychosocial models of disability. But I think one of my points, because I had to write it down, otherwise I'll forget, was what's the evidence of, you mentioned Claudia. There was a point where you were talking about Claudia and how Lestat didn't see her as disabled. She was frozen or anyone else saw her as disabled. And it led to my thought, okay, do vampires in Rice's world have a concept of disability? So if we think about what our definition is, which is sort of outlined, there's the impairment activity, not being able to participate in society, using the sort of the medical model. What reflection did you have in your research that there was a concept of disability? Because you're talking about it, you're discussing it as a concept. But...
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because if we look specifically at male vampires, we have this idea that they can do anything, that they are free to go to whatever places that they couldn't have access to as humans. They have supernatural power and so on. But they don't necessarily have a concept of disability, or they're not aware of disability either in them. Probably they would see disability rather in humans, and they are somehow mesmerized by humans, by their the fragility of their life and so on. So this is why I thought that because Claudia is represented through Louise's memories, I think it's really interesting exactly the point when he sees her disability to a certain extent, when she passes from a child to a woman. So I guess that's when he actually becomes aware that, she was actually frozen in this body, and this body is not going to change in time. I think that vampirism has been so much associated with the concept of immortality, of a body that does not age, that we have somehow lost this perspective on a child's body, right? Because it can be really monstrous. I mean, to be locked in a child's body for 65 years. So I think Anne Rice does something really interesting, because she twists this idea or the preconceptions that we have about immortality. Because we always think about ageless, but you also have to think about what body you bring into immortality. How does your body feel as a woman, as a human, and as a woman, So I think that it was really hard to just pull all the examples together, because we have women as really spectral, as I said before, because they appear, they disappear, they are looked at, they have a few interactions, but they are mainly left in a liminal, let's say, shadow. So we don't really get to see what they think, except for Gabrielle. And when we do, we have this, because it was presented through through Lestat's point of view, because he's reading her thoughts, we have this access to her thoughts that I think is really personal, intrusive at the same time. But I think it really conveys that horror that you probably don't want the others to see, and yet they do, because they're vampires. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, thank you. I've got so many more, but I'll let other people. It brings up all sorts of ideas. I'll chip in after other people have. Thank you. Thanks.
Hey, thank
really
you. Okay, so
little comment from Mason.
Yeah, he does. So Armand is the only one who has the most immediate recognition that there's something very wrong with Claudia, possibly because he was turned so young himself. Yeah, so Armand was turned when he was 16, because he has that understanding of the social element, yeah, of disability. He's just on the borderline of being capable of being able to function on his own in the world, and so he has a strong reaction to Claudia's age. Yeah, I think, but this is definitely true. I mean, I totally agree. Armand was also turned when he was 16, so he's somehow more able to relate to Claudia compared to the other vampires. But also, I think that Armand is this vampire who, because he was the head of the coven of Children of Darkness, he has this idea of rules. Yeah, so he was, especially in the Vampire Lestat, he actually recites the rules of vampirism to Lestat, and he has this conception of the vampiric order that he sees troubled because Claudia was transformed at such a young age. But also, I think that I haven't mentioned it in my talk, but there is this rivalry between Claudia and Armand, because they are somehow fighting for Louis. So even if it's not really well mentioned directly in the novels, we have this idea of rivalry, and at some point Claudia says that she's fighting for her life, but we don't get this immediate implication of probably she's going to switch bodies, or she's going to try to amend her own body. So we only have this later in Armand's book, which I find quite interesting, because Rice always has this narrative technique, yeah, that she uses of reinterpreting the past stories by giving new elements from another vampire's point of view. So I think that this is quite striking in the case presented by Armand. So yeah. But yeah, totally, Armand is more likely to connect to Claudia's age, but also to see the disability and the rules that have been broken when she was transformed. Okay, from Victoria, Armand's religious background probably contributes to his adhesion to the rules too. Yeah, totally. So Armand was part of the Kiev monks as a human. He was then kidnapped, brought to Venice. So that's when he meets Marius, and he's transformed. But yeah, Armand has this deep connection to religion, and this is probably why he feels so attached to the satanic cult that the Children of Darkness have under the Cimetière des Innocents in Paris.
Thank you. Does anyone else have another question? As usual as well, by the way, if you think of one later when your brain's finished processing, you can always get in contact with Laura on Twitter.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I tried to squeeze in a lot of information, but I ended up taking out some of it. So if you want to hear about more examples or other quotes, yeah, most definitely. Yeah.
Sorry, I can't find the hands up bit. Is that all right?
Oh, no, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll stick my hand up. So sorry it's a semi-medical question, but what you've obviously done, it's a PhD research, but I was always fascinated, and I think I read the books, it must be 20-something years ago then, if I was a medical student, I was training, on the fact that Anne Rice's daughter, correct me if I'm wrong, was going through treatment for leukemia, or she passed away. Yeah. So obviously blood transfusions, etc., etc. I mean, how much, and disability and illness, and you know, that concept about ill and well and the in between and the liminal is just fascinating what you're talking about. But how much of that did influence her writing? What are your findings related to?
So Anne Rice, yeah, she does acknowledge this this influence of the pain she suffered because she lost Michelle. But in the biography written by Catherine Kinsland, I think her name is, Prism of the Night, she says that she wasn't really aware of these elements that she was bringing into fiction. So I think that what we have, if we look just at Interview with the Vampire, what we have there is this act of writing in terms of dealing with pain, so with the trauma of losing the child.
Yeah.
So this is why we have her really identifying with Louis, whereas in the other novels he switches for Lestat. But yeah, definitely there are elements over there, and I think that if we look at Queen of the Damned, we also have passages of poems written by Stan, who was also dealing with the loss of Michelle on his own. So we have these two perspectives dealing with pain. I'm gonna try and I don't know if I can find some passage.
An area I'm interested in, and I practice myself. So sort of the uses of writing as I write as well,
it's like,
as therapy.
Exactly.
So, it struck me as a book that was, she was using her writing, not consciously, but
definitely.
As often we don't, you know, but writing through her pain of losing her daughter. Yeah, she lost her daughter by then, hadn't she? So.
Yeah, true. I think it's this. I hope it was therapeutic for her, but we do see this pain actually recurring in the narrative, definitely. And we also see this idea of being trapped in the body of a child. And I do remember precisely that she mentions it in Prism of the Night, that she had this idea that Michelle was aware of what was happening, but her body was not was not functioning. So she couldn't really react, but her eyes showed that she were aware. Yeah. With Egyptian mythology. Yeah, I mean, so the question coming from Naveen, I'm amused by how the narrative is connected with Egyptian mythology. I think that Anne Rice is really obsessed with Egyptian mythology. She went to Egypt. We have Lestat and Gabrielle going to Cairo. We have, of course, the myth of Isis and Osiris, which also comes from this mythological background. And I think that she actually wanted to, or her definition or her explanation of why vampires do not have sexual intercourse actually is rooted in the myth of Isis and Osiris. So when Isis retrieves the body of Osiris without one particular fragment. So this is why the bodies of vampires cannot procreate, and their gratification is not genital but oral. So this is basically why.
I don't know if you've seen the other comments from Naveen there. Not to ventriloquize, I think Naveen's got some sound problems, but she had the honor to meet Anne Rice and mentioned that her Egypt with her husband was an inspirational point for Akasha. So thank you. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's really good. That's amazing. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I know she's really interested in Egypt, and she has this love for the myths that you can actually see in her work. So yeah, definitely. And I'm really, really envious that you got to meet her, and I never got to meet her yet. So I'm looking forward to it.
There's a question from Louise as well. I don't know if you saw.
Okay. So is there also something about a monstrous liminality that is particular to vampires? Yeah, so Turner's original analysis, liminality is a very temporal thing. Yeah, definitely during the ritual, and the social world is expected to return to stability. Yes, I really focus on liminality as an equivalent to immortality, because I would say that we do have the separation, of course, that in rituals of passage. So we have separation, liminality, and reaggregation. But I would say that vampires really linger in this limbo of statuslessness, as Turner calls it. So I'm still looking into to what extent do they actually reaggregate to society. I would say that they pass as humans. So there's this like this crossing of the threshold, if you like. But at the same time, because they only form or they gather as a community in times of distress, I wouldn't actually go as far as saying that they actually reaggregate into communities or into society. The only time when we could say they do that is later on, starting with Prince Lestat, because they gather around Lestat. So probably there we could say that they reaggregate. Something monstrous about liminality. Well, there is a lot monstrous about liminality. I was working on timelessness. So this idea, and I was analyzing Armand's experience of timelessness, and I do find it really monstrous in the sense that because Armand has lived for so long, he's lost his connection to how the human world works. And in order to regain that connection, he's actually trying to create this relationship to either vampires or humans who can give him this sense of time. So in a way, it is monstrous in the sense that with his relationships, he's actually stealing time. If we think about his relation with Daniel, because Armand actually vampirizes Daniel at a psychic level, at a temporal level, so to speak. Daniel loses his sense of time, but also his mind. So we have this idea of stealing people's time, not only their blood, in order to prolong his existence. Another monstrous aspect would be, I'd say, in terms of liminality, would have when vampires are transformed, right? So they don't just become vampires all of a sudden. They have to go through the psychological change, so that they have to feed on people. So we have this what I would call, drawing from Butler's theories of performativity, a monstrous performativity when they are put in the system where they have to reenact the vampiric feeding in order to sustain themselves, but also to confirm their transformation as vampires. So I find that really monstrous in the sense that after you transform, your mind as a vampire is not really, needs time to process that, right? So vampires have this liminal stage of in-betweenness between the human and the vampire, when they have to adjust to the psychological idea and experience of feeding on humans. Yeah, hope that answers your question. I'm still looking into monstrosity and liminality because I think that it's so broad. I mean, there are so many things to look at. So yeah. Okay. Yeah, I agree. We should see the series, and I hope they come out soon. I don't know, especially with the sanitary crisis. I think they're definitely going to be delayed. But my hope is that we do get characters who actually fit the descriptions in the books. So I mentioned that Adam Armand at some point in my talk. So I think that Armand was really my greatest disappointment in terms of the rendition of a character in film. I really like Antonio Banderas, but for the character, I think it didn't work for me. Even if there has been this discussion about Tom Cruise. Yeah, I think that he did a very good job, but for me, Armand was not really there, so to speak. Oh yes, so yeah, Anne Rice got the copyright rights back because there were plans for 3 films, I think, but now they're moving into a TV series, and I think that's really good because that actually allows for multiple episodes, and we do have, I hope, the time to really follow these characters, their moral battles, their experience of liminality and immortality. True. Yeah, I agree. He was not accurate.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw Anastasia's comment as well above. It's just an agreement, but
Okay.
Interesting clarification of her position.
Yeah, I totally agree. So the concept of time that is of paramount importance in the rite of passage. Yeah, is suspended, most definitely. So yeah, we have this idea that vampires actually slip away from time, as I mentioned with Armand, but also with Louis, because part of the reason why he doesn't see the change and he doesn't recognize this impairment in Claudia is because he loses the sense of time. He actually doesn't really, he's not really aware of how much time has passed since she was transformed. So yeah, most definitely. There's this monstrous liminality there that affects them all, yeah.
Interesting.
Mekare, so Mekare is in Queen of the Damned. That's when she appears, but she appears also in Prince Lestat, so the book published in 2014. No worries.
Does anyone else have any more questions, I guess?
So it seems that Louis loses the sense of time after the plantation fire, when his father and all the people he knew are dead. Then he has nothing to see. Yeah, the passage of time. Yes, I think that I totally agree in the sense that he has his family, and when they slip away from the timeline, so to speak, that's when he also gets confused, right? But I would say that he kind of gets some sort of time recognition when in the period that he shares with Claudia, because he tells Armand tells Louis that Claudia was an era for you. So his relationship with Claudia is actually this huge period of time that you cannot really point, but that is so significant on a personal level. So yeah, this is probably why we see him so disorientated later after he loses Claudia. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So she's an example of someone who sounds locked in another suspended condition, most definitely. Yeah, I totally agree. True.
Yeah, I was just typing, sorry, I was just typing slower than I could keep up with. But yeah, no, that's what it reminded me of when you were talking about the brain atrophy as well. Sorry, all the medical stuff comes in. But that's what I used to deal with. So that whole suspended in a body, and then you can only control your eyes in that condition normally. So that's how people communicate. So it's really fascinating condition, but the impact on people and their families. But so I can't remember Mekare. I have read those, the Queen of Adan, but again a long time ago. But and then you were talking about the eyes. Was it her that took the eyes, or one of the characters that had to take the eyes?
Maharet.
Oh, okay, yeah. But those are all like coming together in my head with the eye movements and taking the eyes and stuff. Sorry, that was just a slightly off tangent, but yeah, or not really off tangent, but just how they all link in together and that suspended animation almost.
Yeah,
she couldn't communicate. You said she couldn't communicate, Mekare.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
So Maharet is the one who has her eyes plucked out, but she can communicate. Mekare is the one who cannot speak, but she can communicate through dreams and telepathic images.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm really interested if we can
really
talk
good.
more later.
Yeah, it would be really great actually.
Yeah, most definitely. To have
email. Maybe if I can put it on the group, can I? I can put I don't mind my email going on the group or whatever.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to have more
yeah, it'd be really good
medical point of view, because
thanks.
We think, I mean, even with I was thinking with the COVID and everything, because when we see people, we look at their eyes. I mean, we look at their faces, but we mainly look at their eyes, and I think that's such a strong connection. And I hope this is not going to be hindered by the masks and everything, but there's this connection in the eyes with the people that you are talking with. And especially because Maharet is supposed to steal the eyes from her victims. I think that's very horrific, because I was thinking also about collecting souls that she cannot really preserve in a way. So yeah, could be that as well from a very...
Well, also the Zoom world, I'm looking at you on screen, so whoever's speaking on screen, but yeah, I'm meant to be looking at the camera, aren't I? But I'm not seeing, I'm looking at your eyes on screen, so you see me looking to the right or your left. So it's all that disconnection as well, isn't it? Very interesting. I'll put my in the box, I don't mind filming. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your questions. It's really amazing.
Great to chat to you more, actually, than anyone. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any sort of main questions? Otherwise, I'll probably turn the recording off and we can still keep chatting, but people can feel a little bit freer to chat if they're a bit held back. So thank you so much, Laura. Very interesting. Lots of questions, lots of thoughts coming up. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for being here today. I know it's Sunday and well, everyone is supposed to enjoy their time, but you have to keep up with the Gothic.